I was born in darkness. My father's lungs were stone by the time he sired me. I have never seen the sun, but last week I touched the dead with my bare hands in a clogged vent shaft, and now I see their faces everywhere, even in the dark. What happens to a man who spends his life cleaning the Emperor's air, when the air itself begins to rot? My great-grandfather etched his name into these brass walls before the administratum even knew this junction existed. The letters are worn smooth now, rubbed by 10,000 brushings, but I can still feel them under my fingertips when I work. Karos. That was his name. 4 letters scratched into metal with a broken scraper blade, probably while his lungs were already filling with calcified dust. My grandfather added his own mark 3 meters down the shaft. My father never managed to carve his name before the stone took his chest completely, but I know where he would have put it. I know, because I clean that section every 3rd rotation, and sometimes I press my palm against the smooth brass there and imagine I can feel the ghost of letters that were never made. I have spent my entire life in these vents. 23 years, 4 months, 11 days. I know this because the overseers mark time for us, scratching tallies into the junction boards so we can track our work rotations. I was born in Junction 7, Shaft 3, approximately 40 meters below the surface levels of the Imperial Palace. My mother delivered me between shifts, wrapped me in rags torn from her own cleaning cloths, and returned to work 6 hours later. The midwife was another vent slave, a woman named Carta whose hands were so gnarled from decades of scraping that she could barely hold the knife to cut my cord. I learned later that Carta died 2 weeks after my birth, her lungs finally surrendering to the stone that had been growing in them since she was a child. The vents are everything. They are the world. There is no sky here, no horizon, no sense of distance beyond the next junction, the next shaft, the next section of brass that needs cleaning. The air moves through us, flowing from the surface where the nobles breathe it, down through countless kilometers of ducting, and finally out into the void vents where it is expelled into the cold vacuum of space. We keep that air pure. We scrape away the grime that accumulates on the walls. We brush out the filters. We clear the blockages that form when dust and organic matter collect in the narrow passages. This is our purpose. This is our holy duty. The Emperor breathes clean air because we choke on everything else. My father taught me this. He showed me how to hold the brush at the correct angle, how to apply pressure without damaging the brass, how to breathe through cloth to minimize the dust intake. He taught me the prayers we whisper while we work, ancient words passed down through generations, words that are supposed to sanctify the grime and make our suffering meaningful. He showed me his lungs once, opening his shirt in the dim phosphor light to reveal the gray-white patches spreading across his chest like frost on metal. Stone lung, they call it. Calcification of the pulmonary tissue caused by decades of inhaling brass dust and organic particulates. Every vent slave gets it eventually. The question is not whether, but when. I was 12 when my father could no longer climb the vertical shafts. His breathing had become a wet, rattling thing, like stones grinding together in a leather bag. The overseers moved him to horizontal maintenance, easier work that required less exertion. He lasted 3 more years before the stone filled his lungs completely. I was there when he died, holding his hand in the darkness while he struggled for air that would not come. His final words were a prayer. The Emperor's breath is pure. The Emperor's breath is sacred. We are the filters. We are the stone. Then silence. Then the sound of his body being dragged away to the corpse chutes, where the dead are dropped into the void to float forever in the black between stars. I took his section after he died. Junction 7, Shaft 3, subsection Alpha through Delta. 400 meters of brass ducting that I clean and maintain and pray over every single day. I know every centimeter of that metal. I know where the grime accumulates fastest, where the filters need the most attention, where the air pressure creates unusual resonances that sound almost like voices in the dark. I know the exact spot where my great-grandfather carved his name, and where my grandfather added his, and where my father's mark should have been. I know this section better than I know my own body. It is mine. It is my inheritance. It is my tomb. The work is meditative. There is a rhythm to it, a pattern that becomes as natural as breathing. Scrape, brush, wipe. Scrape, brush, wipe. The motion repeated thousands of times until your arms move without thought, until the brass gleams in the phosphor light, until the air flows clean and pure toward the surface. I take pride in this work. I always have. When I finish a section and run my hand along the smooth metal, feeling no grime, no obstruction, no imperfection, I feel something close to joy. This is what my ancestors died for. This is what I will die for. The emperor's breath depends on my labor, and there is honor in that. There is meaning. Other slaves do not share my faith. I have worked alongside men and women who curse the emperor with every stroke of their brushes, who spit on the brass they are supposed to sanctify, who deliberately leave sections uncleaned as acts of small, pointless rebellion. The overseers beat them for this. Sometimes they execute them, throwing their bodies down the corpse chutes while they are still alive, their screams echoing through the vents until distance or death silences them. I never understood these rebels. We are born to this work. We inherit it from our parents, who inherited it from theirs, stretching back through generations to the first slaves who were sealed into these vents when the Imperial Palace was constructed 10,000 years ago. This is what we are. To resist it is to resist breathing. I believed this absolutely. I believed it when I scraped grime until my fingers bled. I believed it when I breathed through cloth and felt the first specks of stone forming in my lungs. I believed it when I pressed my palm against the smooth brass, where my father's name should have been, and whispered prayers to his memory. I believed it when I watched other slaves die, their bodies dragged away like refuse, their names forgotten before their corpses reached the void. I believed because belief was all I had. The vents were my world. The work was my purpose. The dust was holy. The stone was inevitable. The emperor's breath was pure. Then something changed in the air. It was subtle at first, a slowness in the flow, barely perceptible, like the difference between a strong pulse and a weak one. I noticed it during my third rotation one day, working in subsection Gamma, scraping away at a particularly stubborn accumulation of grime near the filter junction. The air pressure felt wrong. Not dangerously wrong. Not immediately catastrophic, just slightly off. I checked the flow meter, one of the ancient brass instruments mounted on the junction wall. The needle was lower than it should have been. Not by much. Perhaps 5%. But in the vents, 5% is significant. I reported it to my overseer, a man named Karth who had been supervising our section for 15 years. He was one of the surface dwellers, a member of the administratum who had drawn the unfortunate assignment of managing the vent slaves. He hated us. He made no secret of this. To him we were less than human, barely better than the automated scrubbers that had long since broken down and been left to rust in the deepest shafts. But he was thorough in his duties, and when I showed him the flow meter readings, he frowned. "How long has it been like this?" he asked. "I noticed it this rotation," I said, "but it could have been happening gradually. Small changes over time." He checked the adjacent junctions, moving through the vents with the awkward gait of someone unused to confined spaces. All the meters showed the same slight reduction in air pressure. He made notes on his data slate, his stylus scratching against the surface with a sound uncomfortably similar to fingernails on brass. "Continue working," he said finally. "I'll report this upward. Probably just a partial blockage somewhere in the upper levels. Nothing that concerns you." But it did concern me. I had spent my entire life learning to read the vents, to understand the flow of air through these passages the way a sailor understands currents and tides. Something was wrong. Something more than a partial blockage. The air itself felt different, heavier, like it was carrying weight it should not bear. Over the next week, the pressure continued to drop. 5% became 7. 7 became 10. The temperature in our section began to rise, slowly but measurably. The thermometer I kept in my toolkit showed an increase of 2 degrees, then 3, then 4. Other slaves began to notice. Conversations in the sleeping chambers grew uneasy. Some of the older workers, those whose lungs were already more stone than flesh, began to struggle with the thicker air. 2 died in their sleep, their bodies found curled in their bunks like children, their faces peaceful despite the suffocation that had taken them. The overseers became more frequent in their inspections. They descended from the surface levels in groups of 3 or 4, checking meters, examining filters, demanding explanations that none of us could provide. The air pressure was dropping throughout the entire vent system. Whatever was causing it was not localized to our section. It was systemic. It was massive. It was above us. Then, on the 14th day after I first noticed the change, the emergency summons came. Karth descended with 6 other overseers, all of them carrying heavy work lamps and breathing apparatus. They gathered us in the main junction, 53 slaves from various sections, all of us standing in the dim phosphor light while they consulted their data slates and argued in low voices. Finally, Karth stepped forward. "The upper levels are suffocating," he said. His voice echoed strangely in the junction chamber, flat and without inflection. "There is a major blockage in the primary vent shaft, approximately 20 meters below the surface. We need it cleared immediately. You will ascend and remove whatever is obstructing the flow." 20 meters below the surface. I had never been that high. None of us had. The vent system was divided into zones, and we were permanently assigned to the lower levels. The surface zones were maintained by a different caste of workers, slaves who were considered more reliable, less contaminated by the deep darkness. For us to be called up meant the situation was desperate. "What's blocking it?" someone asked. One of the older slaves, a man named Petros, whose hands trembled constantly from nerve damage. "That is not your concern," Karth said. "Your concern is clearing it. You have 12 hours. If the blockage is not removed by then, the nobles in the upper palace will begin to experience respiratory distress. That is unacceptable." He divided us into teams. I was placed with 9 others, a mix of old and young, all of us expendable in different ways. The old because their lungs were already failing. The young because we had not yet proven our value. We were given basic tools, scrapers, brushes, hooks, ropes, and told to follow the overseer up through the vertical shafts toward the surface. I had never climbed so high. The journey took 3 hours, ascending through junction after junction, passing through zones I had only heard about in whispered stories. I saw markings from slaves who had worked these sections generations ago, names and prayers scratched into brass that had been polished smooth by countless hands. I saw filtration systems of incredible complexity, ancient mechanisms that still function despite millennia of continuous operation. I saw sections of the vents that gleamed like mirrors, cleaned to such perfection that I could see my reflection in the brass, a thin figure with hollow eyes and dust-stained skin, a ghost moving through golden tunnels. The temperature rose as we climbed. By the time we reached the 15th junction, it was hot enough that sweat dripped from my face and soaked through my work clothes. The air pressure was noticeably lower here, the flow reduced to almost nothing. I could hear strange sounds echoing through the vents above us, creaking and groaning like the palace itself was in pain. The overseer leading us stopped at junction 17. He checked his data slate, frowned, and pointed upward at a massive vertical shaft that disappeared into darkness above. "The blockage is up there," he said. "Shaft Alpha Prime, main arterial vent. You'll know it when you find it." "What about breathing apparatus?" Petros asked. His voice was barely a wheeze. "You don't need it," the overseer said. "The air is still flowing, just reduced. Now climb." We climbed. The shaft was wider than any I had worked in before, perhaps 3 meters in diameter, with maintenance rungs set into the brass walls every meter. My hands found the rungs automatically. my body moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent his entire life in confined spaces. Below me, I could hear the others climbing, their breathing harsh and labored in the thick air. Above me, darkness, and the sound of something wrong. I passed more markings as I climbed. Some were simple names, scratched quickly with whatever tool was available. Others were more elaborate, prayers and dedications carved with care over hours or days. I saw my great-grandfather's name again, here in this shaft where he must have worked before being reassigned to the lower levels. Karos. The letters were deeper here, more carefully formed, as if he had known this might be his only permanent mark on the world. The smell hit me first. 15 rungs from the top, the air changed. The thick, oppressive heat was still there, but underneath it was something else, something organic, something dead. I had smelled death before, every vent slave has, when a worker dies between shifts and their body is not discovered for days. But this was different. This was not one death. This was many. I reached the top of the shaft and pulled myself into Junction Alpha Prime. The others were climbing up behind me, their breathing echoing in the confined space. I stood in the junction and looked toward the source of the smell. The main arterial vent stretched away from the junction like a massive tunnel, easily 4 meters in diameter, one of the primary air channels that fed the entire upper palace. The phosphor lights here were brighter than in the lower levels, bright enough that I could see clearly for 50 meters or more. I could see the blockage. Bodies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, piled in the vent like debris in a clogged drain, tangled together in a mass of limbs and fabric and decay. They filled the tunnel completely, wedged so tightly that no air could pass. The smell was overwhelming, thick enough to taste, a combination of rot and excrement and something sweet and cloying that made my stomach clench. The others reached the junction and stood beside me, staring at the blockage in silence. Even the overseer seemed shaken, his breathing apparatus hissing softly in the quiet. What happened? I heard myself ask. The overseer did not answer immediately. He was checking his data slate, his hands moving mechanically across the screen. Finally, he spoke. There was an incident in the upper palace. A collapse. A panic. People tried to escape through the vents. He paused. They did not succeed. Petros was vomiting in the corner of the junction, his body heaving as he expelled what little food he had eaten that day. 2 of the younger slaves had sat down, their faces blank with shock. I stood and stared at the bodies and felt something very cold spreading through my chest. You need to clear them, the overseer said. All of them. By hand if necessary. The air must flow again. How? Someone asked. However you can. Cut them apart if you have to. I don't care. Just clear the blockage. He handed out tools, hooks on ropes that we could use to drag the bodies toward the junction. Knives for cutting through fabric or, if necessary, flesh. Cloths to tie over our faces, though they would do nothing against the smell. Then he retreated to the far end of the junction and activated his breathing apparatus, sealing himself away from the air we would have to breathe. We approached the blockage slowly, each step an act of will against every instinct that screamed to run. I reached the first body and stopped, staring down at what had once been a person. It was a woman, I thought, though decay had made certainty difficult. She wore the remains of what might have been servants' clothing, though it was torn and stained beyond recognition. Her face was turned toward me, eyes gone, mouth open in a silent scream. I reached down and touched her shoulder. The flesh was soft, yielding under my fingers like overripe fruit. I jerked my hand back, bile rising in my throat. Beside me, one of the other slaves was crying, tears running down his dust-stained face while he stared at the bodies and made small, broken sounds. We have to do this, I said. My voice sounded strange, flat and distant. We have 12 hours. I wrapped the hook around the woman's arm and pulled. The body moved, sliding a few centimeters toward the junction, but it was caught on something beneath it. Another body. They were layered, compressed together by their own weight, and the weight of those who had crawled over them, trying to escape. I pulled harder, feeling fabric tear, feeling something give with a wet sound that made my stomach clench. The body came free, dragging with it pieces of 2 others that had been trapped beneath. We worked methodically, pulling bodies one by one from the mass. Some came easily, sliding free with only minor resistance. Others were wedged so tightly that we had to cut them apart, using the knives to separate limbs from torsos, heads from necks, reducing people to pieces small enough to move. I stopped thinking of them as people after the first hour. They became obstacles, problems to be solved, weights to be moved from point A to point B. This body is caught on that body. This limb is trapped under this torso. Cut here, pull there. Next, I recorded everything. I do not know why. Perhaps it was a way to maintain control, to convince myself that what I was doing was work. Just another task to be completed with precision and care. I counted the bodies. I noted their positions. I estimated their states of decomposition: fresh, hours dead, days dead, weeks dead. Some of them were still warm. Some of them had been there so long that their bones were visible through rotted flesh. I memorized faces before they came apart in my hands. I noted the clothes they wore, the jewelry some of them carried, the small personal effects that told stories I would never know. Body 1 was an older man, approximately 60 years of age, based on the gray in his remaining hair and the liver spots on his hands. He wore the robes of a minor administrative official, green and gold thread, now stained black with bodily fluids. His face was relatively intact, frozen in an expression of confusion rather than terror. I estimated he had been dead for approximately 5 days based on the progression of decomposition and the ambient temperature. His body came apart at the waist when I pulled on it, the torso separating from the lower half with a sound like tearing wet fabric. I dragged the upper portion to the junction. The lower portion remained wedged beneath 2 other bodies. Body 2 was younger, perhaps 25, gender difficult to determine due to crushing injuries that had flattened the torso and face. The clothing suggested female, servant class, possibly kitchen staff, based on the stains and burns on the fabric. This body had been trapped near the bottom of the pile. The weight of those above had compressed it to perhaps half its original thickness. When I tried to move it, skin sloughed off in sheets, revealing muscle tissue beneath that had liquefied in the heat. I used the hook to drag it by the clothing rather than touch the exposed flesh. It left a trail of fluid across the brass that one of the other slaves had to mop up before we could continue working. Body 3 was a child. I noted this immediately, my hands stopping their mechanical motion for the first time since we had begun. The child was perhaps 6 years old, small and delicate, wearing clothes that had once been expensive. Noble birth, I estimated. The body was wedged between 2 adults in a way that suggested protection. The adults had tried to shield the child with their own bodies during whatever panic had driven them into the vents. It had not worked. The child's skull had been crushed by the weight above. I could see brain matter leaking from the fracture. I reached down and pulled the child free, cradling it against my chest as I carried it to the junction. The head rolled against my shoulder. I felt wetness seeping through my work clothes. I set the body down with the others and returned to the blockage. I did not allow myself to think about what I had just touched. I recorded the data. Estimated age is 6 years. Estimated time of death, 3 to 4 days. Cause, blunt force trauma to the skull. Next, body 4 was another administrative official. This one still clutching a data slate in decomposing hands. The slate's screen was cracked, but still faintly glowing, displaying what appeared to be evacuation protocols. I pried the slate from the fingers. 3 of them broke off and remained attached to the device, and handed it to the overseer. He took it without comment, wiping the fingers off on his robes before examining the screen. The official's body was relatively intact. I dragged it to the junction by the ankles, its head bouncing against the brass floor with each pull, leaving small dents in the metal. Body 5 through body 10 were a tangled mass that could not be separated. 6 people, possibly a family unit, locked together in death with arms and legs intertwined. I spent 40 minutes trying to pull them apart before giving up and cutting through the connection points. Limbs separated from torsos. Heads rolled free. Hands still gripped other hands, even after the arms were severed. I sorted the pieces by estimated original body and dragged them to the junction in loads, making 3 trips to clear the entire mass. One of the younger slaves was sobbing while he helped me, tears and mucus running down his face. But his hands never stopped moving. We worked. We had to work. The alternative was to stop, and stopping meant thinking about what we were doing, and thinking meant madness. Body 11 had been pregnant. I discovered this when I pulled on what I thought was one body and found 2. The woman's abdomen had ruptured, whether from decomposition or from the crushing pressure I could not determine, and the fetus had partially emerged. It was small, perhaps 4 or 5 months along, not yet viable. I stared at it for a long time. This tiny form that had never drawn breath, that had died before it could even be considered alive. The woman's hands were positioned over her stomach, as if even in death she had been trying to protect what was inside her. I pulled them both to the junction together, refusing to separate them. The overseer made a note on his data slate, but said nothing. Body 12 through body 20 were guards. I recognized the armor. What remained of it? Imperial Palace security forces, assigned to protect whatever nobles had been fleeing through the vents. Their weapons were still holstered. They had never drawn them, never fought, had simply been crushed along with everyone else in the panic. Several of them showed defensive wounds, arms raised to protect their heads, bones broken from impact or from the weight of bodies falling on top of them. I pulled them free one by one, noting the unit insignia on their armor, the identification numbers stamped into the metal. Someone in the administratum would want this data. Someone would need to know which guards had died and where. I recorded everything carefully, speaking the details aloud so I would remember them later. Unit 7 Gamma. Guard designation 4521. Estimated age 32. Cause of death asphyxiation combined with crush injuries to the chest cavity. Next. Body 21 had been flayed. Not intentionally, but by the movement of the corpses around it as they settled and shifted. The skin had been scraped away by brass walls and the rough fabric of other bodies, leaving raw muscle tissue exposed across the entire back and shoulders. When I touched it, my hand sank into soft flesh that had no resistance. I pulled the body free and watched muscle separate from bone, sliding off in chunks that I had to gather up separately. This one had been dead the longest, I estimated, perhaps 2 weeks. The decomposition was far more advanced than the others. The smell so intense that even through the cloth over my face I gagged with each breath. I dragged what remained to the junction and immediately returned to the blockage, not allowing myself time to process what I had just handled. Body 22 through body 35 were civilians. Servants, artisans, minor functionaries. The people who kept the palace running, but who had no real status or protection when disaster struck. They wore simple clothes, now rotted and torn. Many of them were missing limbs or had been crushed beyond recognition. I processed them mechanically, pulling them from the mass, cutting them apart when necessary, dragging the pieces to the junction. My hands were covered in fluids now, a mixture of blood and lymph and decomposition seepage that made the tools slippery. I wiped them on my clothes periodically, but it did nothing. The wetness soaked through to my skin. I felt it spreading, coating my palms and fingers, seeping into the small cuts and abrasions that covered my hands from years of scraping brass. The others were struggling. Petros had collapsed completely, sitting in the junction with his head between his knees, his breathing a wet rattle that suggested his lungs were failing. 2 of the younger slaves had stopped working and were simply standing in place, staring at the bodies with blank expressions. The overseer shouted at them, threatened them with execution, promised them worse than death if they did not continue. They did not respond. Eventually he gave up and let them stand there while the rest of us worked. Body 36 was different. This one was fresh. Not hours dead or days dead, but so recent that the blood pooling beneath it, it was still liquid. I knelt beside it and pressed my fingers against the neck, checking for a pulse I knew would not be there. The flesh was warm. Body temperature had not dropped yet. I estimated this person had died within the last hour, possibly while we had been working to clear the blockage. They had been alive when we started. They had died while we pulled corpses from the pile, perhaps crushed by shifting weight, perhaps suffocated by the lack of air. I searched for identification and found none. The clothing suggested upper servant class, someone with enough status to be fleeing with the nobles, but not enough to warrant protection. I pulled the body to the junction and set it down with exaggerated care, as if gentleness now could somehow compensate for the fact that this person had died alone in the darkness while we worked meters away. Body 37 through body 50 were another mass, this one even more tangled than the first. People had climbed over each other trying to escape, had pushed and shoved and trampled in their panic, and when the weight became too much, they had all collapsed together into a single compressed unit of flesh and bone and fabric. I spent 2 hours cutting them apart. The knives we had been given were not designed for this work. They were simple cleaning tools, meant for scraping grime and cutting through cloth, not for separating human bodies. The blades dulled quickly. I had to stop frequently to sharpen them against the brass walls, the metal ringing with each stroke, the sound echoing through the junction like a bell tolling for the dead. My hands were shaking now, not from fear or horror, but from simple physical exhaustion. I had been working for 6 hours without rest, pulling and cutting and dragging, and my muscles were beginning to fail. I forced them to continue. I gripped the knife harder, pulled the hooks with more force, dragged the bodies faster. The work was all that mattered. The work was all that kept me from thinking about what I was doing, about what I was touching, about the fact that these had been people with names and lives and families who were probably still waiting for them somewhere in the palace above. Body 51 had jewelry, rings on every finger, a necklace of gold and precious stones, earrings that glinted in the phosphor light. Noble class, definitely. Possibly high nobility based on the quality of the metal and the size of the gems. The body was male, approximately 40 years old, well-fed and soft in a way that suggested a life of comfort. He had died badly. His face showed signs of extreme terror, mouth stretched wide, eyes bulging from their sockets. I wondered what he had seen in his final moments. Had he known he was going to die? Had he felt the weight of the bodies above him crushing down? Had he struggled until the end or accepted his fate with dignity? I would never know. I pulled the rings from his fingers. They came off easily, the flesh beneath them already beginning to liquefy, and dropped them in a pile near the junction. The overseer would collect them later, return them to whatever family could claim them. I dragged the body to join the others. Body 52 through body 63 were guards again. An entire squad, it looked like, probably assigned to protect the noble I had just processed. They had failed. They had died just like everyone else, crushed and suffocated in the darkness, their armor providing no protection against the weight of panicking crowds. Several of them had tried to cut their way through the brass walls. I could see the marks where their combat knives had scraped and scored the metal, desperate attempts to create an escape route that had ultimately failed. One guard still held his knife, the blade broken off halfway down its length, his hand locked in a death grip around the handle. I had to break his fingers to remove it. Body 64 was the oldest person I had found so far, possibly 70 or 80 years old, skeleton visible through skin that had withered to parchment over the bones. This one had been dead the longest, I thought, maybe 3 weeks. The clothes had rotted completely, falling apart when I touched them. The body was light, surprisingly so, as if death had hollowed it out and left only the shell behind. I carried it to the junction, cradled in my arms like a child. This ancient corpse that had somehow ended up in a vent shaft during a panic evacuation. Had they been fleeing something? Had they been trying to reach safety? Had they known how futile it was? Body 65 through body 75 were children. All of them. A group that had been traveling together, probably from the same noble household or school. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 12, all wearing similar clothing, all crushed together in a small alcove where they had tried to hide or take shelter. I processed them one by one, noting ages and clothing and the small personal effects some of them still carried. A toy, a data slate displaying children's games, a small wooden carving of an Aquila. I set each item aside carefully, arranging them in a row near the junction, physical proof that these children had existed and had mattered to someone. Then I returned to pulling their bodies from the pile. I was crying now. I did not realize it until I tasted salt on my lips and felt wetness on my cheeks. The tears came without permission, without connection to anything I was feeling, as if my body had decided to express grief independently of my conscious mind. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, smearing corpse fluids across my face, and continued working. The tears did not stop. They ran continuously while I pulled and cut and dragged, while I processed body after body after body, while I recorded data and made observations and tried to maintain the clinical detachment that was the only thing keeping me functional. Body 76 had been beautiful once. I could tell even through the decomposition, even though the face was partially gone and the hair had fallen out in clumps. The bone structure suggested it, the remaining features, the delicate hands that had probably never done manual labor. Another noble, perhaps, or a courtesan, someone whose appearance had been their value, whose beauty had been their power. It had not saved them. Death had taken them just as thoroughly as it had taken the servants and the guards and the children. I pulled the body to the junction and set it down with the others. This person who had once been lovely and was now just meat and bone rotting in the darkness. Body 77 through body 82 were so badly decomposed that I could not determine individual identities. They had merged together, flesh liquefying and mixing until it was impossible to say where one body ended and another began. I used hooks to drag the entire mass to the junction. A single load of human remains that weighed approximately 70 kilograms and left a trail of fluids across the brass floor that took 3 of us to clean up afterward. The smell from this mass was the worst yet, a combination of rot and chemicals and something else I could not identify, something that burned my throat and made my eyes water even more than they already were. Body 83 was the source of the original blockage. I found it wedged into a collapsed section of vent wall, brass bent inward from some impact that had happened before the panic, before the bodies had piled up. This person had gotten caught on the jagged metal, had been unable to free themselves, and everyone else had piled up behind them. One person, trapped by circumstance and metal, had caused the deaths of everyone else in this shaft. I pulled them free, noting the deep lacerations across the torso where the brass had cut into them, the way their clothing had been shredded by the sharp edges. This body was older than the fresh one I had found earlier, but newer than most of the others. Perhaps 3 days dead. I dragged it to the junction and stared at it for a long time, thinking about causation and consequence and the way a single moment could cascade into catastrophe. Body 84 through body 90 were positioned in a way that suggested they had been trying to help the trapped person. They had died within reach of body 83, hands extended toward them, bodies positioned as if they had been pulling or pushing or attempting to free the obstruction. Good people, perhaps, or simply pragmatic ones who had realized that freeing the blockage was the only way to save themselves. It had not mattered. They had died trying, their bodies adding to the pile, their efforts wasted. Body 91 was wearing ceremonial robes. Ecclesiarchy, I realized. A priest or preacher, someone connected to the Imperial cult. The robes were elaborate despite the decay, covered in religious iconography and prayers embroidered in gold thread. This person had probably been leading the evacuation, offering prayers and comfort to the fleeing crowds. They had died like everyone else, crushed and suffocated, their faith providing no protection against the physics of panic and confined spaces. I found a small prayer book still clutched in their hands, the pages soaked with bodily fluids but still readable. I set it aside with the children's items, thinking perhaps it should be returned to the ecclesiarchy, that someone should know one of their own had died here. Body 92 through body 105 were the last of the mass. I pulled them free one by one, cutting and dragging and processing them with the same mechanical efficiency I had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. My hands no longer shook. My tears had stopped. I felt nothing now except the physical sensations of the work, the weight of the bodies, the texture of decaying flesh, the resistance of fabric and bone. Each body was a task to be completed. Each task brought me closer to the end. I focused on that single fact and continued working. The final body, number 106, was positioned at the very top of the pile, hands reaching upward toward the surface as if they had been trying to climb over the others even as they died. Young, maybe 18 or 19, wearing clothes that suggested student or apprentice status. They had almost made it. Another meter, perhaps less, and they might have reached clearer air, might have escaped. Instead, they had died within sight of salvation. One hand stretched toward freedom, while the weight of the dead pulled them down into darkness. I pulled this last body free and the blockage was cleared. Air rushed past us immediately, a great inhalation that pulled through the junction and up toward the surface, carrying with it the smell of death and decay. The temperature began to drop. The flow meters on the walls started rising, needles climbing back toward normal operating parameters. Above us, somewhere in the palace, nobles were breathing easier, their discomfort alleviated by our labor. We had cleared 106 bodies in 11 hours and 42 minutes. I had touched every single one. I had pulled them apart and dragged them to the junction and noted their details in my mind with careful precision. 106 people who had died trying to escape something I would never know about, whose final moments had been panic and crushing weight and darkness. 106 people who were now stacked in Junction Alpha Prime, waiting for disposal crews to arrive and drag them away to the corpse chutes. The overseer checked his instruments and nodded. "Acceptable," he said. His voice was muffled by the breathing apparatus. "Return to your sections. The corpse disposal teams will handle the rest." I looked down at my hands. They were covered in dried fluids, caked with blood and worse things, stained a dark brown that I knew would never completely wash out. The cuts and abrasions I had gotten from years of scraping brass were now filled with organic matter, contaminated with the residue of the dead. I could feel it under my skin, seeping into the small wounds, spreading through my bloodstream toward my heart. The others were already leaving, climbing back down the vertical shaft toward the lower levels, eager to escape the junction and the bodies and the smell that would probably follow us for days. I stood alone for a moment, looking at the cleared vent shaft, at the brass walls that now gleamed where the blockage had been removed. Clean, pure, ready to carry the Emperor's breath to the surface. I turned and followed the others down. The descent took longer than the climb. My muscles were exhausted, my hands barely able to grip the rungs, my legs shaking with each step down. I passed my great-grandfather's name again, those 4 letters scratched into brass so long ago. Karos. I wondered if he had ever done something like this. I wondered if he had ever touched the dead and felt them touch him, back in ways that went deeper than flesh. I reached Junction 7 and returned to my section, subsection Alpha through Delta. 400 meters of brass, that was my inheritance and my tomb. The phosphor lights were exactly as I had left them. The tools were arranged in their proper places. The grime on the walls waited patiently for my brush and scraper. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly the same. I picked up my brush and approached the nearest section of wall. The brass gleamed under the phosphor light, perfect and unmarred. I pressed my hand against it and felt the cold metal against my contaminated palm. Then I began to scrape. Scrape, brush, wipe. The rhythm that had defined my life. The motion I had performed thousands of times. That my father had performed thousands of times before me. That his father had performed before him. Sacred work. Holy duty. The emperor's breath made pure by our labor. I felt nothing. The motion was empty. The rhythm was hollow. I moved my arms, and the brush moved, and the brass gleamed, but there was no meaning in it, no connection to the faith that had once sustained me. I was simply moving, simply going through motions, simply existing in the space between one moment and the next. I worked for 3 hours before I noticed the sore on my palm. A small red mark, circular, approximately 1 centimeter in diameter, centered over one of the cuts I had gotten from the brass shards in the collapsed vent. The skin around it was inflamed, hot to the touch, weeping clear fluid that ran down my wrist when I moved my hand. I pressed my thumb against it and felt pain, sharp and immediate, followed by a deeper ache that spread up my arm toward my elbow. I recorded the observation. Lesion diameter 1 centimeter. Color, red with white center. Fluid clear, slightly viscous. Pain level moderate to severe. Suspected cause: contamination from contact with deceased bodies. Treatment options: none available in current environment. Expected progression unknown. I continued working. The sore wept continuously, soaking through the rag I wrapped around my hand, leaving small wet spots on the brass wherever I touched it. I ignored it and continued scraping. The work was all that mattered. The work was all I had left. More sores appeared over the following days. My right hand developed 3 more, all centered over cuts and abrasions, all weeping the same clear fluid. My left hand showed 2. Small red marks appeared on my forearms, where I had rolled up my sleeves, while working in the junction, where fluids had splashed and soaked through fabric to touch skin. Each sore followed the same pattern: small red circle, inflammation, weeping fluid, deep ache that spread through the surrounding tissue. I documented everything with the same clinical precision I had used while clearing the bodies. Sore locations, sizes, colors, fluid characteristics, pain levels, progression patterns. I noted that the sores did not heal. I noted that new ones appeared every day, spreading from my hands to my arms to my chest, where my contaminated clothes had pressed against skin. I noted that the clear fluid they wept had a faint smell, something organic and wrong that reminded me of the junction. The other slaves avoided me. They saw the sores spreading across my arms and recognized contamination. They had seen it before, probably, in other workers who had touched things they should not have touched, who had carried something back from the deep vents or the corpse chutes or the places where organic waste accumulated in the filtration systems. They knew that contamination spread. They knew that proximity to the contaminated was dangerous. They gave me space in the sleeping chambers. They did not speak to me during rest periods. I became invisible, a ghost among ghosts, notable only for the red marks spreading across my skin. The overseer documented it in his reports, but took no action. Vent slaves were expendable. If I died from the contamination, another would take my section. If I continued working, that was acceptable, as long as the brass was cleaned and the air flowed and the emperor's breath remained pure. My personal status was irrelevant. I continued working. I scraped brass with weeping hands. I brushed filters while sores opened on my chest. I performed my duties while my body slowly rotted from the inside out, contamination spreading through my bloodstream, toxins from the dead seeping into my living tissue and changing it into something else. The faces began appearing 2 weeks after I returned from the junction. I saw them first in my dreams, pale and empty-eyed, staring at me from the darkness. The woman I had touched first, the child whose head had rolled against my shoulder, the noble with terror frozen on his face. the pregnant woman with her hands over her ruptured stomach, all of them watching me, silent and still, their eyes following my movements through the dream landscape. I woke from these dreams gasping, my hands clutching at my throat, convinced I was suffocating under the weight of bodies. But when I opened my eyes, the faces remained. They were there in the shadows of the sleeping chamber, pale forms, barely visible in the dim phosphor light. They were there in the vents while I worked, watching from alcoves and junction openings. They were there when I closed my eyes and when I opened them, persistent and inescapable. A permanent presence that followed me through every moment of every day. I tried to convince myself they were hallucinations, symptoms of the contamination spreading through my brain, toxins affecting my perception and creating images where none existed, but they felt too real, too present, too specific. I could identify each face, match it to a body I had pulled from the mass, remember the exact moment I had touched it and felt its weight in my hands. These were not random phantoms generated by a failing mind. These were memories made manifest. These were the dead refusing to stay buried in my thoughts. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply watched. Pale faces in the darkness, empty eyes tracking my movements, mouths open in silent screams or silent prayers or silent accusations. I worked while they watched. I ate while they surrounded me. I tried to sleep while they pressed close, their faces inches from mine, their eyes reflecting the phosphor light like polished brass. After a month, I stopped trying to distinguish between what was real and what was contamination. The faces were there. Whether they existed outside my mind or only within it was irrelevant. They were part of my reality now, as permanent as the vents and the brass and the stone growing in my lungs. I accepted them the way I accepted the sores on my skin, the way I accepted the pain that had become constant background noise to every waking moment. They were mine. I had earned them by touching the dead. They would stay with me until I joined them. I began to draw them. I do not remember deciding to do this. I simply found myself one day with my scraper in hand, pressing it against the smooth brass of the vent wall, carving crude lines that slowly resolved into faces. The woman first, then the child, then the noble. One by one, I transferred the images from my mind to the metal, scratching out the features I saw everywhere, giving them form outside my own perception. The work was meditative. Each line carved was a line of tension released. Each face completed was a weight lifted from my thoughts. I drew between my work shifts, using every spare moment to add another figure, another set of eyes, another mouth frozen in its final expression. The faces spread across the walls of my section. Covering the brass I had spent years keeping perfectly clean, marrying the surface I had polished until it gleamed. The overseer noticed during his next inspection. He stood in my section, staring at the walls now covered in crude figures, and his face went through several expressions: confusion, disgust, anger. Finally, he settled on resignation. "Clean this," he ordered, immediately. "This is unacceptable defacement of imperial property." I obeyed. I took my scraper and brush and spent the next 6 hours removing every mark I had made, polishing the brass back to its original gleaming state. The faces disappeared one by one, erased by the same tools I had used to create them, reduced to brass dust that I swept into disposal containers and sent down the waste chutes. When the overseer returned, the walls were perfect again. Clean, unmarred, exactly as they should be. He nodded his approval and left. I waited until his footsteps faded in the distance. Then I picked up my scraper and began drawing again. The faces returned faster this time, my hands moving with practiced efficiency, the images flowing from my mind to the metal without conscious thought. I drew them all. 106 faces covering every available surface in subsection Alpha through Delta. They stared from the walls while I worked. They watched while I rested. They followed me through every moment of my existence, now visible not just to me but to anyone who entered my section. The other slaves stopped coming to subsection Alpha completely. They diverted their paths through adjacent shafts took longer routes to avoid passing through my jurisdiction. I was alone with the faces, with the sores spreading across my skin, with the contamination rotting me from the inside out. The overseer returned 3 more times to order me to clean the walls. 3 more times I obeyed, scraping away the faces, polishing the brass to perfection. 3 more times I waited for him to leave before beginning again. Eventually he stopped coming. Eventually he accepted that the walls would be marked, that my contamination had progressed beyond simple physical symptoms into something that affected my behavior in ways that could not be corrected through discipline or threats. I drew the faces every day, maintaining them, redrawing them when they faded, adding details I had not included before. The woman's missing eyes became more pronounced. The child's crushed skull became more detailed. The noble's expression of terror became more vivid. Each face gained definition, gained individuality, became more than just a crude sketch and closer to a true representation of what I had seen in the junction. I spoke to them sometimes. Not conversations, not dialogues, but simple acknowledgments. You were body 17, approximately 8 years old, 14 kilograms, cool to the touch but not cold. I carried you to the junction and your head rolled against my shoulder. The words were statements of fact, clinical observations delivered without emotion, but they felt like prayer. They felt like the only honest worship I had performed in months. My father had taught me that our work was sacred, that the suffering we endured had meaning because it served the emperor. He had believed this absolutely, had died with prayers on his lips, had found comfort in the thought that his pain purchased purity for those above. I had believed it too, once. I had found meaning in the scraping and the dust and the stone growing in my lungs. I had taken pride in my section, in my 400 meters of gleaming brass, in the air that flowed clean because of my labor. I tried to return to that faith. I performed every ritual my father had taught me, every prayer he had whispered over the brass, every gesture of devotion that was supposed to transform suffering into sanctity. I scraped grime that barely existed. I polished brass that was already perfect. I inhaled dust deliberately, breathing deep the calcified particles that would eventually turn my lungs to stone, offering my body as a filter for the emperor's air. I felt nothing. The motions were empty. The prayers were noise. The faith that had sustained my father and his father and his father before him had died somewhere in Junction Alpha Prime, buried under 106 bodies, suffocated by the weight of the dead. The only thing that felt real was the contamination, the sores spreading across my skin, the faces staring from the walls, the rot that I could feel spreading through my tissue, changing me cell by cell into something that was no longer entirely human. This was concrete. This was measurable. This was real in a way that faith had never been. I documented my own deterioration with the same clinical precision I had used on the bodies. Day 32, post-contamination. Sores now cover approximately 60% of visible skin surface. Weeping has decreased, but discoloration has increased. Dark rings around each lesion suggest tissue death. Motor control in hands decreasing. Difficulty gripping tools. Day 45. Sores have spread to face and scalp. Vision affected. Possible contamination of ocular tissue. Dreams now continuous whether sleeping or waking. Cannot distinguish faces in walls from faces in mind. Day 63. Significant weight loss. Estimated 20 kilograms below normal body mass. Lung capacity reduced. Stone formation accelerating. Expect complete calcification within 6 to 12 months if contamination does not kill me first. I did not know if anyone would ever read these observations. I spoke them aloud while I worked, recording them in my memory with the same care I recorded the faces. Perhaps my daughter would remember them. Perhaps someone would find meaning in the data, would learn something from my deterioration that would help them understand or prevent future contamination. Or perhaps the observations would die with me, forgotten like my name would be forgotten, lost in the endless darkness of the vents. The choice presented itself without fanfare, without drama. I could continue as I was, a rotting shell going through motions that no longer meant anything, maintaining a section that no one would ever use, drawing faces that no one would ever see. Or I could surrender completely, let the contamination take me, die and be dragged to the corpse chutes like my father before me. I chose to continue, not because I had hope, not because I believed the situation would improve, not because I thought my work still mattered. I chose to continue because choosing was the only thing I had left, because even hollow shells could refuse to break until they were completely destroyed, because somewhere in the depths of my rotting mind, I still believed that my suffering should purchase something, even if it was only the proof that I had existed and had tried to maintain meaning in a meaningless situation. But the rot chose differently. The contamination accelerated. The sores became ulcers, deep wounds that exposed muscle and bone. My hands failed completely, fingers curling into useless claws that could barely grip the scraper. My lungs filled with fluid and stone. Each breath a conscious effort, each inhalation a burning struggle. The faces multiplied until they covered not just the walls, but every surface. The ceiling, the floor, the tools, my own contaminated skin. I do not know exactly when I died. Time had become fluid, moments stretching into eternities, eternities compressing into single heartbeats. I remember working, or trying to work, my ruined hands scraping uselessly at brass already covered in drawings. I remember the faces watching me, with something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. I remember thinking that I needed to record one final observation, needed to complete the data set, needed to note the exact moment when contamination became death. I remember my daughter finding me, or someone who claimed to be my daughter. She stood in the junction and looked at the walls covered in faces, at my body curled in the corner like the bodies I had pulled from the mass, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized. Not grief, not horror, understanding. She had seen the faces too. Maybe not the same ones, maybe not in the same way, but she understood what the drawings meant. She understood what I had become. She did not clear the drawings. She maintained them. When new slaves were assigned to subsection Alpha through Delta, she showed them the faces and told them the story, or the parts of it she knew. A slave had been sent to clear a blockage in the upper vents. He had touched the dead with his bare hands. He had brought something back with him. The contamination had spread through his body and mind until he could do nothing but draw what he had seen. The faces were his warning, his proof that some duties marked you in ways that went deeper than flesh. The story spread through Junction 7 and beyond. Other slaves came to see the faces, standing in my section and staring at the walls while they tried to comprehend what the crude figures represented. Some recognized their own ancestors among the drawings, great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who had disappeared during the panic, who had never returned from whatever incident had driven the nobles into the vents. The faces gave them closure, or something like it, confirmation that their ancestors had died and where and in what manner. The overseers tried several times to scrub the walls clean, to remove the drawings and restore the brass to its proper gleaming state. But there were too many faces, too much area covered, and each time they cleaned a section, new slaves redrew what had been erased. The faces became permanent, a fixture of subsection Alpha through Delta that persisted across generations, maintained by descendants who had never known my name but who understood the importance of preservation. A rule developed, unspoken but absolute: do not climb past Junction 17. The upper vents are contaminated. The surface zones carry death. If another blockage occurs, if bodies clog the shafts again, other slaves will be sent to clear them. Not those from Junction 7. Not those who maintain the marked sections. They have inherited the warning, and they will heed it, will refuse to climb, no matter what the overseers threaten, because the faces on the walls prove that some contaminations are worse than death. My daughter's daughter added new faces over the years, drawing slaves who had died in the lower sections, workers whose lungs had finally filled with stone, children born in darkness who never survived to adulthood. The original 106 became 200, 300, eventually too many to count. The walls became a memorial, a record of every death in Junction 7's living memory, proof that the forgotten were not entirely forgotten. But the original faces remained distinct. The crude drawings I had made, while contamination rotted my brain, while the dead stared at me from every shadow, while I tried desperately to transfer what I saw onto brass so that something of the truth would survive. The woman with empty eyes, the child with the crushed skull, the noble with terror frozen forever on his face. 106 people who had died in panic and darkness, reduced to scratches on metal, maintained by hands that would never know their names. I am those scratches now. I am the marks on the brass, preserved and maintained and passed down through generations. I am the warning that some duties change you in ways that cannot be predicted or prevented. I am the proof that touching the dead leaves contamination that spreads deeper than skin, that infects thought and dream, and the fundamental sense of meaning that makes suffering bearable. I am forgotten. My name was never carved. My daughter did not know it. Her daughter did not learn it. But my drawings remain. My faces persist. The crude figures scratched into brass during the final months of my deterioration. When contamination had progressed so far that drawing was the only thing I could do, the only way I could prove I still existed in some meaningful form. The descendants continue the work. They scrape brass and brush filters and pray over the grime, just as their ancestors did, just as I did before I climbed to the surface and touched what should never be touched. Their lungs are turning to stone. The calcification spreads through their tissue with the same inexorable progression it spread through mine, through my father's, through every slave born into the vents. In 10 years or 20 or 30, they will die gasping for air that will not come. Their final words, probably prayers they no longer believe. Their bodies, dragged to the corpse, chutes to float forever in the void. But they will not climb past Junction 17. They will not touch the dead in the upper shafts. They will not bring back contamination that spreads like rot through flesh and mind. They have learned this lesson, purchased with my suffering, recorded in the faces that cover the walls of subsection Alpha through Delta. They know that some prices are too high, that some duties mark you so deeply, that dying becomes preferable to completion. What happens to a man who spends his life cleaning the Emperor's air when the air itself begins to rot? He learns that the air never rots. The air flows on, pure and clean, carrying the Emperor's breath from surface to void, maintained by the labor of those who choke on dust and die forgotten in darkness. The man is what rots. The man is what changes. The man is what becomes contamination, spreading through his own tissue, converting living cells to dead matter, transforming faith into emptiness and meaning into mechanical motion. He becomes a warning. He becomes faces on a wall, crude drawings maintained by descendants who understand that memory matters even when names are forgotten. He becomes proof that the system works exactly as designed. The Emperor's breath remains pure because slaves die to keep it pure, filtering toxins through their bodies, absorbing contamination into their tissue, rotting from the inside out so that those above can breathe clean air and never know the cost. I am that proof now. I am the scratches on the brass. I am the faces in the darkness. I am the warning passed down through generations. Do not climb too high. Do not touch the dead. Do not bring back what waits in the upper shafts. I am the silence when the air stops flowing, when the vents hold their breath, when slaves press their hands against walls, covered in crude drawings, and wonder what their ancestors endured to leave these marks. I am the dust. I am the stone. I am the rot that spreads when you believe suffering has meaning, when you touch death with bare hands and expect to return unchanged. I am the answer to the question I asked at the beginning, when I still thought contamination was something external, something that could be cleaned away like grime. The contamination was always internal. The rot was always in me, waiting for the right trigger to spread, to convert faith into despair and meaning into emptiness. Touching the dead simply activated what was already there, revealed the truth I had spent my entire life denying, that our suffering purchases nothing, that our faith sanctifies nothing, that we die forgotten and meaningless while the Emperor's breath flows on pure and clean above us. But I left marks anyway. I scratched faces into brass, despite knowing they would change nothing, would prevent nothing, would mean nothing to anyone except the descendants who maintained them without understanding why. I continued working even when the work lost all meaning, even when my hands failed and my lungs, filled with stone and contamination, rotted me cell by cell. I chose to persist because choosing was the only dignity left to me, because even meaningless suffering could be endured with intention, because the alternative was surrender, and some part of me refused to break before I was completely destroyed. I am those marks now, those intentions, those refusals. I am what remains when everything else is stripped away, body dead, name forgotten, faith destroyed, meaning dissolved. I am scratches on brass in junction 7, shaft 3, subsection alpha through delta, maintained by hands that will themselves become dust, remembered in drawings that will outlast every slave who creates them. The Emperor's breath is pure. The Emperor's breath is sacred. We are the filters. We are the stone. We are the warnings. We are the faces. We are the rot that spreads through the faithful when they touch death and expect to remain unchanged. We are the silence when the air stops, when the vents hold their breath, when everything we believed proves false and we continue anyway, because continuation is the only choice left. I am all of this now, forever, until the palace falls, and the vents collapse, and the brass walls corrode into nothing. I am the answer scratched into metal, maintained by the forgotten, warning the doomed what happens when you touch the dead is not that they contaminate you, but that they reveal the contamination that was always there, waiting in the darkness of faith, hiding beneath the surface of meaning, ready to spread the moment you reach for something real.